Helena Bottemiller Evich is a Politico reporter. She reports on food and agriculture. She's also about to wrangle a panel that, when I saw who the panelists happened to be, I thought, this is going to be trouble, but in a good way. Helena, good luck with that.
Got it. We can sit back comfortably.
I know.
Well, thank you for that trouble. I don't know. I don't know about that. Thank you so much. My name is Helena Bottemiller Evich. I'm the senior food and agriculture reporter at Politico. Yes, Politico covers food and agriculture policy. We think it's very important. As a reporter, I find myself often struck by all these massive, really transformative trends that we're facing, these changes. And whether it's climate change, urbanization, land and water scarcity, the astonishing rise in non-communicable diseases, these are really big problems that we're facing, all at the same time that 1/3 of humanity is now between the ages of 15 and 34. So as we talk about all of this, I'm hoping we can drive towards a more holistic conversation, because as a reporter, I often notice that we talk about these things in silos. One group will talk about one part of the problem, another group will talk about another part of the problem. We do the same thing in journalism, we have the same problem. So I'm delighted to have a really excellent panel this afternoon to talk about how we can improve our conversation and our response to these problems. We have a really excellent panel. We have, starting from my furthest, Ertharin Cousin, a distinguished fellow for global food and agriculture at the Chicago Council. We have Dan Glickman, also a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council. He's also a former agriculture secretary under Bill Clinton. I'm sure you all have been following Dan's commentary on the Farm Bill, which has been taking up a lot of time. Then we have Mercy Lungahu, a research scientist at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. And then we also have Roger Thoreau, another senior fellow on global affairs at the Chicago Council and a former longtime journalist. Roger, I'm going to start with you. There's this term that I've been hearing more about called planetary health. I actually hadn't heard about this term until this fall. And it seems to be a way to look at climate issues and public health in a non-siloed way. And I'm now hearing this be brought up more and more. Where does that term come from? What does it mean? Why are we talking about it now?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's, and you've written well, so Politico not only covers agriculture, but you do it extremely well. So thank you for that and keeping our focus on that. Planetary health, I would say, is kind of this emerging movement that really embraces the imperative of forging this new era of human cooperation that will allow us to avoid this looming collision of these two great challenges that we're facing in the future. Nourish the planet and save the planet. And so if our task is producing, more food to feed an ever-growing and ever more prosperous population, ever more food, ever more nutritious food, to nourish this population, while at the same time guarding the planet and protecting the planet from the consequences of meeting these shifting demands of the consumer pressures and demands that are unleashed on that threaten our biodiversity, our environment, our health. And so we find ourselves sitting at this nexus. So all of us in this room, and particularly all your students, this is your kind of a great challenge or great task that I see. We're sitting at this nexus of agriculture, nutrition, environment, climate, animal health, human health, plant health, insect health, soil health, water health, and in planetary health and in that emerging movement and emerging science, you have to look at all of these things together. And so it's breaking, it's banishing this kind of blinkered thinking that, everybody has kind of on this front, banishing kind of the blinkered thinking and demolishing all these silos and recognizing that, look, movement on action on any one of these fronts impacts something else, because every living thing on this planet is linked together on the global food chain. So all these forces that are roiling and running up and down the global food chain, they unleash all these forces, and unless we're thinking about them all together, nobody lives a siloed life, right? Certainly none of us, and certainly in the developing world. So just a quick story, that one of the moms that I follow in the First 1,000 Days book in Uganda, she was doing everything right on the nutrition front. She was growing more nutritious foods, the biofortified orange flash sweet potatoes, high in vitamin A, the high iron beans, so high in iron, vitamin A and iron, really important in the 1,000 days. She has a pregnancy that was much better than her first one, and her first child died within the first 2 weeks. So she's feeling better, more energetic during pregnancy. She gives birth to a really healthy child, a big child. She's so proud of him. All the neighbors are coming over, the family's coming over. The next time I go and visit her, I say, "How is little Aaron?" And she immediately breaks down sobbing, and she says, "His development has stopped since the last time you were here." And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "He had dysentery from our well water that went bad." All this work and all the good work on nutrition that she was so proud of, and had this beautiful boy who was defying the odds of low birth weight and stunting and malnutrition in northern Uganda, was basically undermined by a couple of sips of bad water. And so that's why we have to look at all these things together, because certainly the people that are leading these lives see all this together in their lives. So one example.
Good, yeah.
So Ertharin, talk a little bit about what are the barriers to looking at these problems more holistically? How can we tackle them looking at the big picture and not necessarily from one part of the problem?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and I want to thank the council for having me here today. Roger started this when he said, we work in silos. Everybody here today is here because we're talking about youth and agriculture. Today is World Water Day. And I went through Twitter for UN Water and Water for Health and Water for Life, not one mention of agriculture. 70% of all the clean water is used for agriculture. And the two communities can't come together, won't come together. You have the WASH community, the access to clean water for drinking and sanitation, that is a very strong coalition, as well as the agriculture community, that is a very strong coalition. The people we serve need reasonable policies that support the shared resource of water and land that will ensure not only access to nutritious food, but also that will ensure that that this renewable resource, and in some places non-renewable resource, of water is appropriately used. It's not happening today. We also have the challenge of energy. There's a nexus between water, energy, and food that must come together. When we began this discussion of creating agricultural food systems that will support sustainable value chain or sustainable access to food by increasing the value chain from farm to fork, we talked about increasing agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa with seasoned tools. But there was little talk about water at that point, because everybody said water will come, because they were only thinking about very large water projects and the impact that those very large water projects would have or didn't have on some of the investments that had been made in the 1980s and early 1990s. But now with climate change, the most vulnerable populations need water, access to water, to overcome the risk of climate change as much as they need access to appropriate seeds and tools. And they also need access to energy. And so we need collective action, which requires communication and trust across different communities in order for us to develop those policies and tools that will appropriately serve to meet the whole planetary health needs of the communities that are expecting us in conferences like these to devise the right answers.
It's amazing how two so seemingly related sectors or thought spaces would be that disconnected. I see the same thing happen a lot in nutrition and agriculture. The nutrition community is like one community, and the agriculture community is a different community, and there is not a lot of crossover. So Dan, I want to turn to you for a minute, because I think you have seen this in your experience in the ag policy field, and now doing a lot more work on nutrition as well at the Bipartisan Policy Center and elsewhere. This massive rise we have in non-communicable diseases, how does that play across this notion of needing to work together? Does agriculture need to get more involved in that side? Because right now you have the public health people kind of raising the alarms about the global rise in things like obesity and diabetes and these lifestyle diseases.
Well,
but where's ag? Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's very interesting, and the U.S. farm policy, as complicated as it is and as often as troublesome as it is, the foundation over the last 30 or 40 years has been to combine nutrition with production agriculture. So it doesn't do it very perfectly, but at least it's created both.
They're at least in the same bill.
They're in the same bill,
Yeah.
but they wouldn't pass if they weren't in the same bill.
Yes.
So it brings the urban and rural together. But I want to give you an example of first of all, I want to echo Ertharin and Roger, what they said. So a few years back, I was on a task force of the Council on Foreign Relations, and they were doing a report on non-communicable diseases in the developing world. Okay, very interesting. Those are diabetes, heart disease, cancer, arthritis, high blood pressure, not Ebola or malaria. Okay, so we get in this report, and as we start writing the report, and there are a lot of very brilliant people there, and they were almost all in the health community. I was probably the only guy in the room that could spell agriculture. Okay, so anyway, we get there, and the report as it's being written is almost exclusively about ending tobacco consumption in the developing world. Good idea, and bringing pharma into the developing world. So we'd have Lipitor maybe, or whatever kinds of drugs that were there. There was virtually no mention of nutrition at all, none. It was just strange. So I raised the subject, and I think they looked at me like, who is this guy, and what does he know about these things? Because there were some very brilliant people there, but they were almost all health people, physicians, allied health folks, not a lot of nutritionists in the room. So I said I wouldn't sign the report unless they added a provision on nutrition. So they did, because I'm from the school, the French philosopher who said, you are what you eat. But it's interesting, because in that room there were virtually no people in production agriculture or farming at all. I suspect in this room today, are there any physicians in the room? Are there any people in allied health professions, largely allied health professions in this room?
Got one.
One.
Two.
Great. Two. Okay. So you see, this goes back to the holistic or unholistic nature of what we're dealing. I mean, nutrition obviously is a key part of people's lives. It impacts disease. I mean, look, we know type 2 diabetes, which, by the way, is increasing at the fastest rate in the world, in the developing world. Has a lot to do with this. So this idea of getting rid of the silos has a real impact on people's health, and it also has a lot to do with the nature of health in the developing world. One other point, people were talking about jobs here. So the fastest growing part of the job market in the developed world is in healthcare professions. And so I'm thinking about what are opportunities in the developing world as we start learning more about how to eat better and how to take care of yourself better. The same thing can be true there as well. Some countries have done a better job. Ethiopia, for example, has big extension programs to deal with health and agriculture. So they help farmers. They also help smaller communities to deal with the problem. But nutrition is often ignored. And one of the reasons it's ignored, it's not taught in medical school. Very few doctors know very much about nutrition at all.
And they also eat out of vending machines.
Yes.
Well, that I don't know for
They're not
sure.
the healthiest people.
And so this goes back to your point that ending silos, it's really important. And that's one issue. You talked about water and energy. It all relates to each other.
Yeah, and it's definitely not easy. So Mercy, I want to bring you into this conversation. So let's talk for a minute about the diets of vulnerable populations and what we still need to know, what we still need to learn about that, and where you think we can make the most progress. Like, what do we need to know to better this situation?
Thank you for the question. I'll talk from the perspective of Africa. And what I would like to say is that we don't really know what works. And we have to be honest about this, because a recent study has challenged our definition of a healthy diet. And so we have to come together and agree on what constitutes a healthy diet. Let me give you an example. I cannot ask you, oh, hi, what nutrients did you have for lunch? That's not how we look at food. We look at different combinations in different amounts. But when I come to do research, like Roger said, I do beans and I look at anemia as an outcome. I'm looking at a single food and nutrition outcomes. But that's not how the world works. And this tells us very little about diets. So for example, we have some data on diets that work, like the Mediterranean diet, but we don't have data for diets for vulnerable people, and this is a major gap. And also when I look at Africa, where we have indigenous foods and fruits and vegetables, we know very little about many of these foods. And that knowledge gap is really affecting our understanding of how we guide communities on how to pick foods, the policies we champion, or even what we encourage farmers to grow or food companies to process. So what I see is that this is an opportunity to really come together and create knowledge that will help us do things better. There's a complexity that I should highlight. Let me get the example of Kenya, for example. We have different cultures. I'm from the Luhya community. Somebody from the Kikuyu community, who's my neighbor, we cook very different foods. So it becomes difficult to understand these things. Across countries, in Kenya, the neighbors are Uganda and Ethiopia. The staple food in Kenya is maize, in Ethiopia is teff, in Uganda is banana. So that complexity also comes in. But even when we look among individuals, if I looked at what I eat, what my mother ate growing up, my grandmother, you see the differences. So you see complexity across geographies, across time, across cultures. This means that as food researchers, we have to become creative in the way we're going to look for this information. And for donors, they have to just change how we do things and fund things that can really help us to get the information we need to move forward.
I think you raised a great point about scientific gaps, because without that science, without that knowledge, it's pretty difficult to come up with policy like interventions. And it's actually something we struggle with in the US too. I mean, you hear these loud debates every time we do the Dietary Guidelines, which sets our nutrition recommendations, and people fight bitterly over different definitions of science, even though we've been studying the dietary patterns of the U.S. for a long time, and to hear that there's just such paucity of data is I think that shows that there's probably a long way to go. So I want to transition for a minute, zooming out to this issue of having such a large population of youth, just having such a young global population, and what that means going forward in terms of this nexus between nutrition and climate and food security. We often mention national security. We often mention, preventing, violence and by tackling these problems. But I was hoping that the four of you could weigh in a little bit on how you talk about this issue. Are there specific examples when you're trying to get a policymaker to understand that national security and food security are not separate issues? Like, what do you tell them? Because that's probably kind of another silo where the national security community is not really as engaged with the food security side of things.
Well, the national security community, surprisingly, is quite interested in food security. There's a
means of preventing.
Preventing food insecurity, because there's a recognition that economic instability and food and insecurity create instabilities and ultimately create security. It can ultimately create security challenges when the government does not respond to that food insecurity, nor does the international community provide the interventions that are necessary to address that food insecurity. As a result, you will have situations where instability is created. Many would argue that the now 8-year war in Syria was a direct response to the fact that there was a drought for 3 years that resulted in agricultural production challenges over that 3-year period, decreases in the harvest, and the farmers went into the Capitol to seek support from the government, and there was no appropriate response, and as a result, a conflict developed. I would not oversimplify it in that way. I would not suggest, I don't think any of us on the stage would suggest that there has ever been a direct link developed between food insecurity and instability and conflict. But you can bet in the car that drives towards conflict and instability, food security is always in there, either as a passenger, if not a driver.
I just say I would agree totally with what you're saying. It's not the only cause, but it is a cause in people's minds that causes people to leave, to move, maybe cross country or maybe cross borders. And it's a big factor. And it's also a reason why, to be honest with you, the countries, the developed world have to maintain their humanitarian assistance, which you, of course, ran the largest humanitarian assistance organization in the world for a while, because if we don't do that, then, in fact, you'll have chaos. But I want to give you one example in our own hemisphere. We talk a lot about sub-Saharan Africa, but we have a situation in Venezuela which is almost as bad as any place else in the world. In fact, there have been an equal number of refugees leaving Venezuela in the last 5 years as there have been Syrian refugees. The population of Venezuela has gone from 28 million to 24 million. The wealthy have gone to Miami and Spain. Everybody else has gone to Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and they haven't taken, I think, much, if any, UN assistance. They've had 10,000 kids under the age of 1 year die in our own hemisphere. This isn't halfway around the world in an area where there's been conflict forever and ever. So and in many cases, of course, their governance system there is terrible. They really don't even have a government. And governance is a big factor in terms of feeding people and keeping a lot of functions going. But it's happening close by and could impact the United States of America. And it's just an example of the fact that food insecurity is one of the factors. But as you say, there are many other factors. Governance is also a huge factor in determining whether a country can work at that. And most of the people who have left are young people, because they're the ones that can't take it any longer.
Yeah, I was going to say that Dan, that you mentioned migration. I think it's a really important thing in this notion of planetary health, because migration affects all these issues as well. Certainly human health, nutrition, why are they moving, the disruptions that come from that, conflict that maybe somebody, say all the coastal communities in West Africa that depend on seafood, both as their way of life and their living, and also their protein and their nutrition. Well, if all the industrial trawlers are in there overfishing that, they're having to move inland. They're conflicting then with farm societies and more settled communities. Where are they getting their nutrition from? I was also going to say that when you look through history, the lack of food or food insecurity is at the root of so many of the revolutions down through time. The Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, let them eat cake, the Arab Spring, that was partially from with the food, and the food vendor set himself on fire that triggered things. And it was in Haiti, the government fell in Haiti during the food crisis in 2007, 2008. It was the earthquake then that got us all looking at Haiti. What's happened here? The real social upheaval was the food crisis in Haiti. And so I think it's just such a direct link that for anybody to kind of not acknowledge that isn't living in reality.
Well, I come from the school of thought that says we should not wait for the crisis to act. So I see hidden patterns in all this, the food insecurity and conflict trap. And what I'm saying is, can we find, like he talks about the 1,000 days in nutrition when you should act. What is the 1,000 days in this case between the lack of resources and the trigger for conflict? For example, in Senegal, I worked with young boys, teenagers, who had tried to cross over to Europe, but it was too difficult, and they had to come back. But what triggered them to think of migrating was water poverty. In today's World Water Day. So sometimes when you look at some of these patterns, Food security comes at the very end. Then it becomes a tipping point. But if we're able to catch the signals ahead of time, we're either able to de-escalate conflict or eliminate it all the same.
I mean, how many families do you know that are sending one child, two children, three children abroad, particularly from Africa into Europe, because they need the money to be sent back for food? Yep. Or the water insecurity pushing them, or climate change, that they just can't farm there anymore, and the conditions are changing. So it's critical, particularly for the youth population.
Yeah, and we're going to open it up for questions in just a minute here. Mercy, you and I were talking backstage a little bit about how you engage young people in tackling these problems and being part of the solution. Do you think that there's any sort of example to point to of where either a nonprofit or government or company is doing a good job of really bringing young people into the fray, like as far as?
Well, I'm from the CG, so I'll give you a CG example. I love the IIT because it has a youth program that is really helping young people, giving them responsibility in agriculture and mentoring them to learn how to do agriculture. There are two things I want to take away from the IIT program. One is that they teach the young people to learn how to negotiate. In life, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. They're teaching these young people how to make deals. And I think there's one young person who will speak later today. The other thing is the right mindset. Young people don't feel agriculture is sexy, but that's not the issue. Look at the lemonade that we can make out of these lemons. We have food insecurity, we have low employment. How do we make agriculture work for us? Look at this as opportunities to really bring positive change. So IIT, kudos to them. I'm happy to be linked to that.
Yeah, and make agriculture sexy. I'm into it.
Can I just add one point to that? We have about 3,500 public corporations in the United States. The world has changed. So power centers have changed. We don't always have to rely on the government. There are shareholder requirements now and responsibilities where average people can push companies to do things that they couldn't do 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. And not just food companies, but other companies in the non-food sector can be productive in encouraging people to become engaged in this, particularly with young people. I want to mention one final thing, which hasn't been talked about before, the demography. I'm 73 years old. I expect to live to be at least 50 more years. I know that.
I think you're on.
All right, okay. Modern medicine is going to have people living a lot longer everywhere. So one of the things we need to look at is the demographics of the problem we're talking about today. I don't have any simple answers to it because I'm not necessarily going to keep the same job my entire life, and I may do something else. But demographics have a lot to do with health and with the ability to survive. And hopefully everybody in this room will benefit from the miracles of modern science and research as well.
And then we'll have even more people to feed.
There you go.
So, yeah.
You know, when you talk about how do you talk to young people about agriculture and making agriculture sexy? You make agriculture sexy by making it profitable. And what you won't have are young people in developing countries who have lived and watched their parents and grandparents as subsistence farmers adopting those same agricultural practices, those same, performing that same work when they see opportunities off-farm in urban areas. You will have migration. When we can create the kind of food systems that support increased economic opportunity from agriculture, more access to the financial resources that are necessary for young people to invest in either on-farm or off-farm jobs and opportunities that will increase not just their entrepreneurial opportunity, but increasing jobs, it's sexy then. And that requires not just building a new lens for commercial banks to invest in agriculture, but the kind of equity investors like RISE, when they see the equity investors, when Joy spoke earlier about the work that RISE is doing in agriculture, those are the tools that are necessary that we need more of to ensure that agriculture makes money. It becomes a market opportunity, then it's sexy, then young people will adopt it.
Yeah, so we're gonna open it up in 1 minute. We have one question already through this high-tech system we have here. Agriculture is a source of greenhouse gas emissions and will be very affected by climate change. What trends are emerging in climate-smart ag? That is one of those sectors that is between, you have the environmental science and then agricultural science sort of talking together.
So I would say it's one, is if you were to ask me who is the most powerful force in food and agriculture, it is the consumer now. So the consumer is demanding all sorts of things, how people are being paid, labor trends, nutrition, and climate. And they want to know if food is being produced in a way that doesn't increase carbon in the atmosphere and that kind of thing. The second thing is research. Nutrition research, soil health research, photosynthesis research, animal health research, all these things. And the research trends haven't been looking also all that good the last 20 or 30 years, and not in the United States. The Brazilians and the Chinese have done a lot better, but that's also, if we don't know the facts and the data, it's going to be really hard to deal with this problem.
Yeah. Agricultural research is something it seems like a lot of people agree on, yet it is still a matter of finding the money to invest in it. And I don't know.
Yeah. And there's a lot of innovation. I mean, as Dan says on that front, all those things, the photosynthesis, I was at a photosynthesis lab at the University of Illinois, and it's fascinating what they're doing, that they were things that maybe were thought about during the original Green Revolution. For various reasons, they didn't pursue that, but now they're looking at, this is something we can advance. It's precisely getting, one of the things that we'd get at is unclear. We're dealing with this really fascinating paradox with climate change and agriculture. Obviously, agriculture is on the front lines and is the first to be impacted, farmers everywhere, by climate change. But as the question says, agriculture is also a big contributor to climate change. We look to agriculture to be our salvation, but it can also be our ruination if we don't have the mitigation and reversing these negative impacts. Because as other industries hopefully improve on their emissions, if agriculture stays the same from kind of 25% of greenhouse gas emissions now in agriculture and land use, that number is just going to basically climb and climb and climb. But some people are saying agriculture may contribute, 60-70% of GHG.
And I think there is more focus on that. It is sort of a slow conversation that kicks up, especially around focusing more on soil and the types of practices you can do that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Does anyone have a question in the audience? Do we have mics?
While you're getting that question, let me just say that one of the recommendations in the report is that the U.S. increase our investment in research by 1%, at least 1%, to support public research. And so that is a quantifiable recommendation in the report that we should all support, that we should all encourage our members of Congress to approve.
Right there, your question.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Kent Ford with Creative Associates International. Roger, about 9 years ago, you wrote in the book Enough that in a world of plenty, we have way too many people, hundreds of millions of people starving. And this is a panel on megatrends. So we have all these amazing megatrends, all this great technology. Secretary Glickman may actually live to be 120 with some of the technology we have today. So, but I guess my question for you and then for all the panel is, how are we doing? With all of the technology, as I travel the world, I see some improvements, but I see so many areas where we're just so far behind. How are we doing, and are there one or two mega trends? Are there one or two areas that really, if we can address, really will make a difference over the next 20 to 30 years? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kent. And Femi keeps asking everybody about their levels of optimism on things, and mine kind of is, depending on what day it is, or who I've just had a conversation with, or what country that I've just visited in terms of, an optimism of making progress on this front, but in looking at the looming problems. I mean, one of the encouraging things I think, as I guess it would be a megatrend, is kind of this embracing of this imperative of looking at these things together. So on agriculture and climate change, that's not just something for kind of farmers and the ag researchers to deal with. It is a huge issue also for the conservationists, for the environmentalists, because if they want to preserve biodiversity, and they want to preserve the forest and the grasslands and things, they need to be talking to agriculture. They need to be talking to the same researchers that are there doing things for the benefit of farmers and nutritious and food consumers. And so I think that's encouraging if everybody kind of really takes this on board and embraces it and says, this is basically the only way forward.
You know, this is probably a subject that's too controversial, although it's mentioned in the report, is obviously family planning has to be part of the discussion here, you know? I mean, you know, it's like we can do a lot.
It sounds like it's not controversial.
Not in this audience.
Maybe not here.
Right.
And I'm not arguing for any specific positions on any very difficult political issues, but there's no way to deal with the problem from an aggregate sense without thinking about it a little bit.
Yeah.
Another mega trend that I think will really help in leaving no one behind is digitizing agriculture. It has helped to de-risk agriculture. For example, in Kenya, we have Farm Drive. They look at credit worthiness of farmers and help them to get credit. A friend of mine at ILRI is using index-based insurance. So when farmers lose their crops, their animals, they're able to get compensation. Lillian was here talking about M-Farm. So bringing digitization into agriculture and de-risking the process will really help us to reach further.
Yeah, it's a great point.
I think one of the other megatrends that we're just beginning to talk about was 42 leaders across Africa coming together this week to sign a trade pact, the largest trade pact of its kind. That could potentially overcome many of the barriers that have detrimentally impacted the ability for cross-border trading and regional trading across the continent, which would reduce the cost of food substantially as we move forward.
I imagine too, regional cooperation makes it maybe sometimes a little bit easier to break down the silos because you get everyone in the same room. Yes. All right, I think we have a question right here. Yes.
Hi, my name's Tambra Stevenson with WANDA, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. And I have a two-part question. It speaks to policy and media. One, would the panel recommend or suggest or support the idea of the U.S. government investing in the nutritional value of African foods that would benefit African immigrant communities as those across the Atlantic? And second, the role of arts, entertainment, media hasn't been talked about. When we think about the Beyonce of nutrition, what would be a world if we supported a character for kids that encouraged the silo smashing of nutrition, ag, water, and health that promoted it in a way that was fun and engaging, like the Dora of Africa?
The Beyonce of nutrition.
Of nutrition.
There we go.
Interesting.
Could be you.
No.
Yeah.
Bring it all together. Who wants to respond to that? Yeah.
I like the first part of that question about indigenous foods. Before, I wouldn't have thought it was a thing until I listened to countries. Kenya, for example, is having a National Nutrition Week, and the theme is our food, our culture, our nutrition. Countries are saying we need to better understand indigenous foods and make them part of our food system. So I think that would be a welcome investment because it aligns with country values. And I love the next part of your question. Why not? We need to make better food choices a trend, a thing. And if I have a Beyonce to help me do that in communities, I take it.
Oh man, okay, we have like 30 more seconds. If we can do one quick question, yes, and then we'll wrap up. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Gina Castillo and I work for Oxfam. I have a question on the role of food companies. This is a mega trends panel, and I just wonder what you think their role is. On good days, I think they could contribute positively to nutrition outcomes. On bad days, I don't. There was a great article in the New York Times last